My name is Rachel Palmer. I'm 37, and just last week, I attended a professional gala where I was being honored for my work in research and education. It was a night I'd been anticipating for weeks, a celebration of everything I'd built over the years. But as fate would have it, the moment I stepped into the restroom to take a breather, I came face to face with someone I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. My mother. She was at the sink, reapplying her lipstick, looking every bit the part of the wealthy socialite she'd always been. For a moment, I thought maybe she wouldn't recognize me, but then her eyes flicked up to the mirror and landed on my reflection. Her hand froze mid-motion, and I saw her jaw tighten. "Rachel," she said, her voice cool and detached, like we'd just bumped into each other at a country club instead of a bathroom after 15 years of silence. "I didn't expect to see you here." I steadied myself, gripping the edge of my clutch. "I could say the same," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What brings you here?" She turned to face me, her posture as rigid as ever. "Your father and I were invited, of course. We've always been involved with organizations that support education. And you?" "I'm being honored tonight," I said, meeting her gaze. "For my work in research." Her expression barely shifted, but I caught the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes before she masked it. "I see," she said, turning back to the mirror. "Well, I suppose everyone finds their way eventually." Her words brought me back to the day I walked out of that house for the last time. I was 19, and the years leading up to that moment hadn't been easy. In high school, I struggled with depression, but in my family, that wasn't something you admitted. "What could you possibly be sad about?" my mother had said once, her voice dripping with irritation when I tried to open up to her. "You have everything, more than most kids your age. You're just making excuses." The truth was, I'd been drowning. The pressure to be perfect, to live up to the Palmer name, was suffocating. I tried to keep up, but my grades started slipping during my junior year, and by senior year, I was barely holding on. My parents didn't see a kid who needed help. They saw a failure, an embarrassment. When I only got into a community college, my father's fury was unmatched. "This family has standards," he had said that night, pacing the living room while I stood there clutching my acceptance letter. "And you've done nothing but drag us down. You want to waste your life? Fine. But you'll do it on your own." I had been kicked out of the house. I remember the weight of that duffel bag as I left the house that night. It wasn't just filled with clothes. It held the reality of being completely on my own. My parents didn't even come to the door to say goodbye. My mother stayed seated on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if I didn't exist. My father had disappeared into his study after delivering his ultimatum. I felt invisible, discarded, like I'd never been a part of their world to begin with. For the first few weeks, I stayed with a friend, sleeping on her pull-out couch while I tried to figure out my next steps. Community college wasn't glamorous, but it felt like the only thing I could control. I worked part-time at a diner to cover tuition and rent when I finally scraped together enough to move into a tiny studio apartment. It was a grind, balancing classes, work, and the overwhelming sense of failure that clung to me like a second skin. But something about being on my own, away from their constant judgment, gave me a flicker of hope. For the first time, I could breathe, even if the air felt thin. My first year at community college was a blur of late-night study sessions and endless shifts at the diner. I'd decided to study chemistry, partly because I genuinely enjoyed it, and partly because I wanted to prove to myself, and maybe even to them, that I could excel in something challenging. It wasn't easy. My high school grades had been mediocre at best, and I felt like I was starting from behind compared to my classmates. But for the first time in years, I wasn't under the crushing weight of their expectations. I could just focus on learning. I still remember my first chemistry exam. I'd spent weeks preparing, going over every formula, every reaction, until I could practically recite them in my sleep. When the professor handed back the graded tests, I was terrified to look. But there it was, a 92%. I nearly cried, right there in the middle of the classroom. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I'd earned it. It felt like the first small step toward rebuilding myself after everything had fallen apart. Over the years, I evolved in ways I never expected. College wasn't easy, but I had learned how to work for what I wanted, and the more I gave, the more I saw myself grow. By the time I finished my associate's degree, I wasn't just a student anymore. I was someone who had learned how to fight for her place in the world. I transferred to a 4-year university, and while I still faced obstacles, I had learned how to push through them. The shy, insecure girl who barely got by in high school had become someone who could stand in front of a class, explain complex concepts, and hold her own. Chemistry, once a challenge, became my passion. I didn't just want to pass anymore. I wanted to excel, to prove that I wasn't the failure they thought I was. I worked part-time, still, but I also started interning at local research labs, gaining experience that eventually led me to an opportunity I never imagined, becoming a lead researcher at a nonprofit focused on advancing science education. It wasn't just a job. It was my way of giving back, of creating a space where other kids, the ones who were told they weren't good enough, could find their way too. Graduating with my bachelor's degree was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but when it came time to celebrate, I realized something. My parents hadn't even called. Not to congratulate me, not to ask about my plans. Nothing. My father, the owner of a massive fertilizer company, had more money than he knew what to do with. He and my mother lived in a mansion, threw extravagant parties, and rubbed elbows with politicians and CEOs. But for all their wealth, they'd never taken an interest in me unless it was to criticize. Even after I graduated with honors, after I'd worked my ass off to get where I was, I didn't exist in their world. I was a reminder of their failure, an inconvenient blemish on their perfect lives. It stung more than I wanted to admit. I had hoped, maybe foolishly, that they'd at least acknowledge the hard work I'd put in. But they didn't. It was as if I never mattered to them, and that realization hit harder than I cared to admit. The only family member who bothered to show up at my graduation ceremony was Aunt Lydia. She was my mother's younger sister, the black sheep of the family. Lydia had never cared much for my parents' rigid standards, and while they shunned her for being too eccentric, she was always kind to me. She was the one person who would call on my birthday, even when my parents pretended I didn't exist. When I saw her in the crowd, I felt a lump form in my throat. She waved at me excitedly from the back, and after the ceremony, I found her in the parking lot, waiting with a huge bouquet of flowers. "You did it, kid," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you." It was a small comfort, but it was something. It wasn't the cold silence I'd gotten from my parents. Aunt Lydia was the one who reminded me that family didn't have to mean perfection, that love could come from unexpected places. She didn't care that I hadn't followed the straight path they wanted for me. She cared that I had made it on my own, no matter the hurdles. A few months after graduation, I was wrapping up a research project at the university when one of my professors, Dr. Collins, pulled me aside. He was an old-school chemist, the kind who had a passion for the periodic table like it was a work of art. He'd noticed my work ethic, my persistence despite everything I'd been through. "Rachel," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I've been in touch with some colleagues at Oxford University. They're offering a research opportunity in environmental chemistry, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." At first I thought it was a joke. Oxford? One of the most prestigious universities in the world? Me? But Dr. Collins insisted. He told me that this wasn't just a job, it was a chance to make real contributions to the field, and that I deserved the opportunity. "Don't let fear hold you back, Rachel," he said. "You've proven yourself. Now it's time to take that next step." I applied, hesitantly at first, not fully believing it could happen. The application process was rigorous, and I wasn't sure I'd make the cut. But then, weeks later, I received an email. We are pleased to inform you that you've been awarded a research grant for your proposed work in environmental chemistry at Oxford University. I moved to England without telling anyone. Not my parents, not any of my old friends. The only person who knew was Aunt Lydia. I called her a few days before I left, and she was the one who encouraged me to go. You've worked too hard to let anything hold you back, she said. Do this for yourself, Rachel. She understood why I needed to disappear, why I needed to escape the shadows of my past and carve out a new future without anyone's expectations hanging over me. I asked Lydia not to tell anyone else where I'd gone. I didn't want them to try and find me, didn't want the weight of their judgment pulling me back. So, I left, boarding a plane to Oxford, with nothing but a backpack, and the faint hope that this could be my chance to finally become the person I always dreamed of being. I settled into a small flat in Oxford and threw myself into my work. The first few weeks were tough, the language, the culture, the isolation. But the more I immersed myself in my research, the more I felt at home. I was working on projects that mattered, things that could make a real impact on the world. The chemistry I studied was no longer just about passing exams or proving myself to my parents. It was about changing the future. As the years passed, I completed my master's degree, and then, driven by the momentum of my research, I applied for a PhD. The process was grueling, but I was determined. I had found my place at Oxford, and there was no turning back. After several years of sleepless nights and endless lab experiments, I earned my PhD, becoming a respected researcher in the field of environmental chemistry. After finishing my PhD, the next step seemed almost too surreal to grasp. I was offered a position as a professor at the University of Cambridge. It felt like a dream I never dared to chase, not because I didn't think I deserved it, but because I never imagined I would be given the chance. I had worked so hard to get to this point, and yet, the recognition still felt like it was happening to someone else. At Cambridge, I was able to teach and mentor the next generation of students, something I hadn't expected to find so fulfilling. The freedom to shape minds, to pass on the knowledge and passion I'd gained, was beyond anything I could have imagined back when I was struggling through community college. I had gone from being the girl who didn't belong to someone who could stand at the front of a classroom and be taken seriously. But there was still a piece of me that was always looking over my shoulder, wondering if anyone back home knew where I was, if anyone cared enough to find out. I hadn't heard from my parents since I left. No calls, no letters, no attempts to reach out. I wondered if they even thought about me. As my mother turned back to the mirror, adjusting her lipstick, I felt a familiar weight settle in my chest. Her words, "Everyone finds their way eventually," echoed in my head, and I couldn't help but wonder if she really believed it. I thought about all those years I spent trying to meet their expectations, all the ways they told me I wasn't good enough. The community college rejection, the years of silence, and the way they acted like I didn't exist once I walked out of their house. It felt like a lifetime ago, but standing there in that bathroom, the bitterness still stung. I had worked so hard to get to this point, leaving everything behind, moving to England, finishing my master's and PhD, becoming a professor at Cambridge. And yet, there she was, standing in front of me, acting like my entire journey had been some kind of afterthought. I had gone from being the failure they cast aside to someone who could now speak at international conferences, lead research, and mentor young minds. And for what? To stand here and have her offer me nothing more than a cold acknowledgement? As she left the bathroom, I watched her glide out of the door, back to the people she was comfortable with. I thought about the woman I had become, the woman who'd erased every trace of them from my life. I didn't need their approval anymore. I'd built a life on my own terms, and even though they would never understand, that was enough. The gala ceremony began shortly after my mother disappeared into the crowd. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of that encounter. The clinking of glasses, the hum of polite conversation. It all felt distant now. It was time to take my place, to step into the role I had fought so hard to claim. The stage was set, the lights shining down on the sea of well-dressed guests, and the moment I had been anticipating for months was finally here. I made my way to the front, where they called my name, the words echoing through the room. Rachel Palmer, honored for her groundbreaking contributions to education and sustainable chemistry. The applause was deafening, but it felt strangely hollow, like I was listening to someone else's life unfold. I took the stage, trying to maintain a calm exterior, but inside, all I could think about was the fact that I was standing in front of an audience of people who knew nothing of the path I had taken to get here. No idea what it had cost me to get this far. The spotlight hit me, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. This wasn't just a recognition of my work in chemistry. This was my way of showing the world that I was more than the person my parents had tried to make me believe I was. This was the moment where I stood on my own 2 feet, with nothing to prove to anyone but myself. As I stood there, still trying to absorb the magnitude of the moment, the host's voice rang out, drawing everyone's attention. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have an exciting announcement. In recognition of the groundbreaking work in education and sustainable chemistry that will be honored tonight, a generous and anonymous donor has pledged a grant of $2 million to the recipient of this award. The room went quiet, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. My heart raced. This extraordinary contribution is intended to support the continued efforts of the recipients' research and further their impact on the world of education. I blinked, momentarily stunned. $2 million. The number hung in the air, surreal and overwhelming. But the announcement wasn't directly for me. It was for the recipient of the award, someone whose name hadn't been revealed yet. I was still processing everything when I heard the host's voice continue. This grant, though anonymous, will be bestowed upon the person tonight who has demonstrated exceptional dedication to their work in advancing chemistry and education. For a moment, I didn't know what to think. The enormity of the sum, the way it would change someone's life, was astounding. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't shake. The realization that the donor didn't know it would be me. They didn't know I was the one being honored tonight. As the announcement echoed through the room, my eyes wandered across the crowd, trying to catch a glimpse of the people around me. But then, something caught my attention. A subtle shift in the crowd. Near the back, just beside the exit, I saw him. My father. He stood up abruptly, his face twisted in disgust. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, before he turned sharply and began to make his way toward the door. His movements were swift and deliberate, as if he couldn't get out of that room fast enough. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man who had rejected me all those years ago, the one who had kicked me out of his house, was leaving as soon as he heard the news of the grant. He didn't even stay to see who was being recognized for the award. My chest tightened as a mix of emotions washed over me: anger, disbelief, and something darker, more bitter. This was the moment I had been waiting for. A moment where everything I had worked for was finally being acknowledged, and he couldn't even bring himself to stay in the room to witness it. He couldn't stomach the fact that the daughter he had written off was now standing at the front of the room, receiving everything he had always expected from someone else. As my father made his way toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The strange weight of his sudden departure settled over me, but before I could process it, the announcer's voice sliced through the room again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host continued, "we are incredibly fortunate to not only have a generous donor for tonight's award, but also a longtime supporter of education and sustainable chemistry. The $2 million grant which will be awarded to the recipient of this honor, has been made possible through the contributions of Mosaic Fertilizers, a company led by one of the most influential figures in the fertilizer industry. Mosaic Fertilizers. My father's company. I froze. The donor, the one whose generosity had made this award possible, was my father's company. My chest tightened as the truth hit me. The man who had spent years treating me like an embarrassment, the one who had walked out of the room when he learned of my success, was the one funding this recognition. The irony stung deeply. The same man who rejected my path, who disowned me for pursuing a life that didn't fit into his perfect image, had unknowingly backed the very award that would be the crowning achievement of my career. It was almost too much to process, too much to bear in that moment. I stood there stunned as the announcer's words continued to echo in my ears. The applause around me felt distant, like I was hearing it from underwater. The weight of the grant, of everything that had just been revealed, hung heavily on me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a brief moment I couldn't process any of it. "Thank you," I managed to say into the microphone, my voice shaky but steady enough. The words felt hollow, too small for what I was feeling, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to get out of that room. I couldn't stand there another second, basking in the recognition that felt so empty. I turned abruptly, walked off the stage, and without another glance at the audience, I bolted for the back door. My steps quickened as I made my way through the hallway, heart racing, only one thought running through my mind. My father. I knew he'd left the room. I saw him walk out, his face a mixture of disgust and something else I couldn't quite read. But he couldn't just leave, not like this, not when everything had come full circle. I couldn't let it end like this, with him walking out on the one moment that proved everything he had tried to dismiss about me. I pushed through the door leading outside, scanning the area, my breath coming in quick bursts. There he was, standing by his car, his back to me. My feet moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I was running. "Dad!" I called out, my voice almost cracking as I rushed after him. He didn't look back at first, his shoulders stiff, but when he finally turned around, I saw the bitter expression on his face. He had that same look I remembered from all those years ago, like everything was an insult to him. "What is it now, Rachel?" he asked sharply, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "You think I'm going to congratulate you?" I stopped just a few feet away, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew what this was about. He had no idea who the recipient of the grant was until they called my name. Until that moment, he thought he was just funding some good cause, sending money to the foundation, believing it was going to some worthy academic or researcher he could proudly point to. He didn't know it would be me standing there on that stage. He sneered, his lips curling into a bitter smile. I don't know whether to be disgusted or impressed, but here you are, taking my money. I'm sure that's exactly what you wanted, right? I could see the resentment in his eyes. The grant, $2 million, had come from Mosaic Fertilizers, his company. But once the money was donated to the foundation, it was entirely out of his control. They had chosen who would receive it, and they chose me. The irony hit me like a wave. "I didn't ask for this," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rush of emotions. "I never asked for your money or your approval. I earned this on my own, just like everything else." His eyes darkened and he shook his head. "It doesn't change anything. You're still the failure I kicked out of my house all those years ago. No grant or award is going to change that." I felt a rush of anger, but I pushed it down. It doesn't matter what you think anymore. I've made my own life. And if that money came from you, it doesn't mean anything to me. I turned my back on him without saying another word, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to argue with him anymore. He wouldn't understand, and truthfully, I didn't need his approval. I had spent so many years trying to prove myself to him. And for what? To be here, at this moment, with everything I had worked for, only for him to stand there bitter and resentful of my success? It wasn't worth my time. The next day, I made a decision. I had spent the night thinking about what the $2 million grant meant. At first, it had felt like a victory, a vindication, but by morning, that feeling had faded. It wasn't my victory. It was just another reminder of everything I had escaped. The money, tied to his company, was never going to erase the years of pain and rejection. It wasn't going to heal the part of me that he had broken when he kicked me out of the house all those years ago. So, I donated the entire sum, every last cent of it. I didn't want it. Not from him, not with the strings that came attached to it. Instead, I directed it toward funding scholarships for underprivileged students, students who had been overlooked, underestimated, and written off. I wanted to give them the chance to build something for themselves, without being crushed under the weight of expectations that didn't belong to them. The money that had once been tied to rejection and bitterness was now part of something greater, something that would outlast the sting of my father's judgment. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I pressed the donation button. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need his money, his approval, or his recognition. I had built my own legacy, one that would live on far beyond the walls of that gala.